Agile for Humans, Episode 2.
Processes and tools dominate today's Agile discussions, but we are devoted to the individuals and interactions that make it work. From the beginner to the veteran practitioner, we have something for you. Welcome to Agile for Humans.
One of our guests tonight, Mr. George Dinwiddie. How you doing, George?
I've got a little bit of a cough.
No, that's fine.
Better than
no worries.
yesterday.
And also joining us,
Amitai and Schlair.
Very nice to see you again. We actually met up down at Agile Indy a few weekends ago. Had a great time down there, and I think, George, the last time I saw you, it was Agile Coach Camp in Indianapolis, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so how you guys been since then?
Oh, it's been busy.
That's a good problem, right?
It cuts both ways.
Very good. So the way we do the show, guys, I think as you both know, we're going to kick around a few topics, see which ones we want to dig into, go ahead and tear those apart for as long as it makes sense and move on to the next. We'll keep it within a 60-minute time box because we're Agile people and we like time boxes. And we'll go from there. I think we found a topic that might be interesting. Right before we hit the record button, we were talking about how these two guys are traveling consultants, but I'm a full-time employee that gets to stay home all week, and they were jokingly mentioning the glamorous lifestyle of a consultant. So I'm wondering if that's a fun topic, if you guys want to peel the curtain back a little bit on what it's like to travel to make your Agile living, and we can go into that, and maybe I can talk about the opposite side of the table, hiring the consultants and working through that. Does that sound interesting, or do you guys have anything else you'd like to tee up?
We could go a little into that.
I'm brand new to it, and George, you've been doing it for a while, so maybe that's a good way to come at it.
Yeah, I actually haven't been on the road much for the last year and a half. Been working with local clients, but with DC traffic, it's not necessarily easier to get to them.
Kind of feels like a layover just sitting in traffic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I had that discussion with my fiance. We live in Bloomington, which is in southern Indiana, an hour from some parts of Indianapolis, an hour and a half from where all the tech jobs would be. And she had the opinion that it would be really nice if I could work effectively locally in Indianapolis. There's nothing in Bloomington to speak of. But it would probably mean something like an hour and a half twice a day commuting. And frankly, I don't think I'd be a lot of fun before and after a commute like that. So it's kind of better that I have to, fly out for 4 days every week.
Being a Purdue guy, I totally agree. There is nothing of note in Bloomington, Indiana.
I'm probably supposed to disagree with you now that you said it, but I'm not going to. I like it a lot. It's just not a tech hub.
So you're new to the consulting world. What's been the surprising aspect of it? And the reason I'm asking these questions is I'm fascinated by it and sometimes long for that adventure. So I'm honestly curious about this type of role.
Well, could be Dunning-Kruger speaking, but I guess I'm surprised most by how easily I've taken to it, and the feedback I'm getting so far indicates that either we all have Dunning-Kruger or I really am doing okay. I wouldn't have guessed that. I didn't think that I haven't been in situations that are like that I'm aware of. I took a jump and tried to get into this line of work because in previous teams that I've been on, programming is great. I love it. I'm never going to stop. And that's what makes me effective as a coach, is that I keep doing it. But I guess what I'm surprised by is that the very same behaviors that I enjoyed so much as a member of the team, if I turn them up a little extra, that's all it is, coaching and consulting. And so it seems to be working so far. And I don't know what I don't know, but it seems to be working so far.
So now for the people who don't know, would you go into that Deming-Kruger definition real quick, just for the people out there who may not be familiar with that?
Yes. Dunning-Kruger those are two researchers, I believe, that they did a paper. It's pretty well known among people who have seen it and pretty unknown among people who haven't. People think that they have expertise when they're at the front end of a learning curve pretty early, when in fact they just don't understand how much expertise they lack. Which is exactly what I'm afraid of.
John Cleese has a really great YouTube video on that. He's apparently friends with Dunning and Kruger. He's got a great description of it in his own style, of course.
So we'll track down a link to that and throw it in the show notes. I'd imagine his take on it's going to be pretty good. So, but thanks for that. Now, George, on the flip side, now you said you hadn't traveled in a while, but you have been a traveling consultant in the past. What do you think the state of consulting is today, especially in the Agile space, even from a local perspective? Is it thriving? Is it growing? Is it running at full steam, or is it still trying to get traction?
Oh, well, there's certainly a lot of work out there right now. A lot of people looking for looking for consultants to come in and help them, which is quite different from a year or two ago. Things were a lot thinner, but that kind of cuts both ways. There are a lot of people I see an awful lot of people who've been a Scrum Master once and say, okay, now I'm ready to be an Agile coach. And, and some of them are, but an awful lot of them are not. There's more to coaching than there is just knowing Agile.
That was actually one of the biggest takeaways that I had from Agile Coach Camp in Indy, and it was getting to spend time with guys like you, George, and Don Gray, and Aaron Copel, and all of you guys that and gals that have, Diana Larson was there, Esther Derby was there, getting around you guys and hearing the way that you speak. I realized very quickly that while I think I'm proficient in the mechanics of Scrum, I am a novice at coaching. And that was a huge takeaway for me. It really kind of blew my mind how, while I know the Scrum framework fairly well, I have a good sense of the Agile mindset, I don't have a clue how to coach people. And that was my takeaway from that event. Now, since then, I've been reading books and working on that. And a few people like Don and some others have sent me some great things. And I've been coaching myself, and some other people have been coaching me up. But man, it is more of a true statement than I think George, when you say that, especially when you're at an Agile coach camp and you run into it head on, and you can either ignore it or acknowledge it. I'm glad that you guys, taught me that lesson. But you're so right. It's an amazing difference between being proficient with the Scrum framework and actually knowing how to go in and coach it. Truly a true distinction there.
Well, and a lot comes down to just, what range of situations are you comfortable in? Can you make positive contribution to? A lot of people just naturally, fall into it with some groups of people, but other situations are much tougher, and they may or may not have the skills and background to deal with it. I don't know that anybody can deal with all situations. Jerry Weinberg would be the closest I've ever seen, but he's pretty amazing.
So I'm burned up that I missed that coach camp because it was in my backyard, but I was out of the country that particular weekend. And I think it sounds like, Ryan, you had your feet held to the fire in a way that helped you see your feet more clearly, as it were. And I'm looking forward to having an experience like that with Jerry Weinberg and Esther Derby in about a month in Albuquerque. I'm going to Problem Solving Leadership, and I'm looking forward to having to look at myself harder than I normally do.
Oh, that's such a cool experience. I wish I could do it again.
Can you say a little more about what it was like when you did do it?
Well, I don't, of course, I don't want to tell you any of the exercises. I want you to experience them firsthand for yourself. I will say that you will get benefit from it to the degree which you apply yourself. And so the harder you work at it, the more you put into it, the more thought, and the more you open yourself up to it, the more you'll get out of it. And it was about 10 years ago that I did it, and I'm still learning stuff from it.
See, and that's the fun part, too, that I don't think we ever master this stuff. It's just a constant evolution of thought and mindset, and adding different models to your current state of mind on the coaching topic. And, and what else is great is that, George, people like you guys have been so accessible. You're joining the two of us on a podcast that, I think we're more novice in certain areas, and from coding and Scrum, we're perhaps proficient, but it's just great that in this community that we even have access to people like you and Don Gray and some of those others that have been more than willing to coach up. And so that it's also a sign of I think a very positive theme throughout this Agile community as well. So I guess that's just a little appreciation back towards you for that, for holding the feet to the fire and some of those eye-opening lessons, and I hope they continue.
Well, thank you. I don't really feel that that I've made it, that I'm reached some point where I can relax and not worry. It's a constant growth opportunity, and I think everybody is ahead of everybody else in some way. So
there's an interesting comment that was made about programming makes you an effective coach. I think my friend on the left of my screen here is responsible for that comment. Now, I started as a developer, but I gave it up for a career in management. Do you think that coaching makes all the difference when you go to consult and teach these agile lessons to the companies that bring you in?
Well, speaking for myself, I barely believe the words that I say when I give counsel to anyone myself, just barely. And if I haven't had, my hands on the keyboard and, on the hook for some kind of an outcome recently, then I believe myself less. And I don't see why anybody else should. So just from myself, knowing my own proclivities, my own shortcomings, I have to keep myself honest. It also says in that manifesto that you're supposed to be doing it and helping others do it, and it can't just be one or the other. I happen to like programming, so that's fun for me. But that's for me the real context where Agile comes from and goes back to is we're trying to get some software done. Usually, sometimes it's not software, but usually it is, and that's where I feel most rooted and attached to it.
Yeah, I'm sort of a generalist, and I'm also from a programmer background, and I like the fact that I can sit down and pair with people and help them with technical issues. And I think there's a real advantage to that in being able to get down there with the code. But there's a whole lot of other stuff beyond that. The people aspects are really the more important part and the challenge, I think. Any competent programmer can learn how to do test-driven development, for example, or behavior-driven development. It's not that hard to do if you decide that you want to try it and give it an honest go. And it's the people issues that keep people from trying it. In my case, I looked at, there were a lot of people that I respected on mailing lists that were saying, no, this is the only way they worked. And I was saying, well, but that can't possibly work. There was a little discontinuity between these two ideas. So I thought I'd try it and see it. And, 3 days of trying it full time was enough to convince me that yes, I could do it, and yes, it was worthwhile. And I think anybody can do that. But in a lot of situations, it's really hard for developers to do. I happen to be a little ahead on my work, and so I spent that time going out on this limb and trying it out. A lot of developers never get that sort of freedom at work. And trying to work all day and then study at home, that's a hard thing. So I'm a little ambivalent about, whether the real technical chops are so important or not. Sure, they help. There's an awful lot of times I see where people get so concerned about the process that they forget about the fact that you have to program competently too. And I've seen some really bad code come out of that. But.
Right. So do you think it is difficult just for a pure Agile consultant, or even let's lump a Scrum Master into this question if it makes sense? Is it difficult to show that value that a person in such a role brings? And is that still an issue in the Agile community?
Which person? A person with the technical skills? Or
I'm going to say without. So let's just have a pure Scrum Master or a pure Agile coach, for instance, who's going to be on site to teach the Agile mindset, help teams get up and running, but they're not in a coding role. Do you think it's more difficult to demonstrate their value, or have we cracked that nut?
I think a lot depends on the needs. If that particular group needs someone to demonstrate how to do technical things to them, then you're at a disadvantage. And maybe you need to call on someone else to help you with that. But a lot of it, I've known a lot of people who were technical at one time, but their technical chops were not up to speed at all. And they didn't have to know how to do stuff. They still could tell whether someone else was feeding them a line or not. They could still ask good questions. They could still help facilitate things. And they knew enough to not get fooled by somebody just handing them a line.
I've seen a Scrum Master on a team I'm coaching now that he definitely was a small talker back in the day. And I think he maybe even did XP or something like it. And he's the Scrum Master now for this team, and he's fantastic because he was a programmer and he remembers what that was like, but he doesn't think that he has anywhere near the requisite knowledge to even suggest to people what they should do. So he doesn't have that problem. He's just looking for impediments to remove, process to not follow, anything he can do to keep the wheels greased. He's great. It's a joy to watch him. So I think his value is evident.
Yeah, that's interesting insight, and that's the role So I'm not necessarily in a Scrum Master role, but in a management role. Even though I have a developer background, I've decided I'm not going to pretend that I even come close to understanding what my team's doing anymore. So but even that kind of stretch, it is kind of scary to let that go, but it is something that is somewhat necessary for certain roles, especially at Scrum Master and other coaching levels. Do you guys think we've hit on this contractor consultant type role discussion enough? Are there any last topics you want to bring up about this, or should we move on to the next piece of the discussion?
I guess I have one more idea I would add. That's maybe why I've been able to get such a smooth start. And there are two parts to that. One is to echo and amplify what Ryan was saying. George, people like you, and you in particular, have been accessible to me. Twitter's been fantastic. Mailing lists have been fantastic. George, I think like a year or two ago, when I was trying to make this career move and learn a lot about coaching, you may not remember, but you sent me an email with some references that were very valuable to me. And in general, the bibliography that you have for all the posts that you write gives me, a warren of rabbit holes to go look through for ideas to expand on. It's like Wikipedia for Agile. But so that's one. And the second part is the mindset I brought to it from what my fiance studies, the reason that we're in Bloomington. She's in a PhD program for social animal behavior, in particular how they learn from each other, how they influence each other.
Oh, cool.
And mainly she studies brown-headed cowbirds because they don't come with a lot of pre-cooked behavior. They acquire a lot of it. But even so, even though those aren't people, that frame of looking at the problem has been immensely valuable to me as I try to come in and figure out what is my theory of change for these people in this situation. We're not that different. Maybe we're a little more focused cognitively. Maybe we have abstractions that we like to bandy about, but we still have territory. We still have trust and willingness to do things for others. And like you're saying, ultimately, it's always a people problem. So those two things together, the openness of coaches and consultants like yourself to help someone like me get started, and then this mindset of we're all social learning animals exhibiting behaviors. It's been great.
So, George, something that our friend Don Gray did in the last episode was recommend about 100 different books on various topics. And I think we're going to start a book club just titled Don Gray's Agile Book Club. But I was wondering if you have any recommendations, say that, you're like Amita or myself, and we're trying to get going as coaches, or we just want to understand it better. Where would you point us? What would you say we absolutely must read in order to really start up in this area?
Oh my. I don't know that there's any musts. I mean, there's a lot of incredible stuff out there. If you're going into business as a consultant on your own, then certainly Jerry Weinberg's Secrets of Consulting is very valuable work. And Peter Block's Flawless Consulting is another good book on that topic. And that's just on the consulting aspects. That's not, Agile or software development at all. In Jerry's got a lot of good books. And for his quality software management series, predates Agile, but it's rereading that, it's very congruent with Agile principles. It's looking at things through a management point of view. And so that helps a lot of people. It's a 4-volume series. It goes into how you can tell, what's going on and make judgments and make decisions, and down to the people aspects also. There's a lot of good stuff there. What else would be really good? In terms of a single book to give people a good flavor of what Agile is, then James Shore's Art of Agile Development is really excellent because it's very XP based, so it gets down to the technical practices and talks about that. And it suggests practices, but it talks about how they work with each other and what's the benefit of them, not just a recipe. So those are some good starting points. I'll probably think of some more as we go along.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. And we'll be sure to get links to those books into the show notes. And George, if you think of any more and you send me an email, I'll get those added as well. I think for the next topic, I definitely have a few more, but I'm wondering if you guys want to tee one up so that I'm not dominating the entire discussion.
Well, there was a little discussion as I was stuck on the bus in traffic this afternoon on Twitter about retrospectives and their value. We could go that direction, I saw
I saw that thread, and I thought that one was pretty interesting. The idea of, I think there's a new hashtag brewing called No Retrospectives.
Oh boy.
I don't think so. I don't think so. So Bob Marshall, who kind of triggered me on that, was saying don't do retrospectives, and I'm not exactly sure what he has in mind. I'm quite sure that he's got in mind something better that he considers better. But my feeling is there is not, we're people, we're flawed humans. There's not one way of improving yourself. And the statement he made was, don't have retrospectives, just fix things as they come up. And to me, those two things don't go together. Sure, fix things when they come up. If you see something broken, fix it. If something's not working, talk about it with your team. Don't put it off until a special time sometime in the future. But that's not the point of retrospectives. That's just what people have gotten to think, because they think that, in Scrum, then we're supposed to inspect and adapt, and we've got this one ceremony to do that. And so therefore we have to do all our inspecting and adapting during that ceremony. And that's not true. And in fact, what most of the Scrum literature I've seen on retrospectives tries to boil it down into three questions. What did we like? What did we not like? And what are we going to do differently? And that is not a retrospective. It's mostly a bitch session when you come out that way. So it's really, there's a couple of things that I think are very important, to call it a retrospective. And one is you're looking back over some period of time, and introspecting as a group. But you're gathering data from a period of time, so you've got the benefit of this long-term view that you don't have when you're looking at stuff day to day. And second, you're looking at it together so that you get your view together. So everybody they don't necessarily agree, they don't necessarily have exactly the same view, but they understand the views in the group. And so those two aspects I think are very important in order to be able to see things that you don't see on a day-by-day basis.
Right. You get to have as many feedback loops as you want. You have the ones right in front of your nose if you're paying attention, and sometimes that's not enough to see a bigger pattern if you do it yourself or if you do it with a group. Retrospective is a particular activity that people do in a particular way with a particular expectation of how often they do that. Retrospecting is a thing that we can probably never do too much of, except if we retrospect enough to realize that it's too much. But it's as an activity, what it implies is looking for what needs to change based on how things went. And there is no Agile without retrospecting. So the question is how much and when, and I agree with you, George, it's a false dichotomy to say that we don't need the longer interval with more people and more structure, and we only need the short one. I think we can have as many intervals for retrospecting as we want to.
In my experience, really good retrospectives get beyond just fixing a problem on the surface, solving some issue that we've noticed. They really get down and they test our assumptions and help us fix those. And those are the things that really hold us back. So a good retrospective gets into what's called double loop learning, where we're not just fixing the things that we already know about, the things that need fixing because of the assumptions we're making, but they're testing our assumptions themselves and helping us find completely new ways of looking at the situation and new solutions, therefore, that are more powerful.
You know what strikes me when I see tweets or messages about dumping a well-respected and time-tested practice is there's usually, and I'm not saying that this is the case for this particular thread, but there's usually damage somewhere. Something's been abused, something's been misused, and I'm wondering if perhaps there are some people out there who have had retrospectives turned into, I guess, negative situations or punishment sessions as opposed to being reflective about the sprint, digging into the mindsets of the group members, challenging assumptions, and instead it just becomes, you didn't get this done, you didn't get that done, you're doing this wrong. And I think that when you see those messages about, I don't want to do estimates anymore, or I don't want to do retrospectives anymore, my fear there is that there is some damage or some abuse going on that kind of drives that,
Right.
and that you end up losing such an excellent practice, such as a retrospective.
Well, it's a really interesting practice in that it's very hard to do meaningfully without a great deal of trust. It also builds a great deal of trust, but it's very hard to conduct the activity in a meaningful way if everybody in the room is afraid of what happens based on what they say. And it can be very difficult to establish that they don't need to be.
Yeah, I think it's tremendously hard to set up a safe environment to conduct a meaningful retrospective. But it's something that I've spoken with, my management at times, and we've done these things, that they have to create that not sense of safety but true safety, that you can discuss topics, you can make insightful observations, you can say things that are against the grain and still come out of it with your head on your shoulders. And I find that is, I think you're absolutely right. That is such a difficult thing to establish. And even if you get that buy-in from everyone, it's hard to get everyone to believe that it's actually true.
So, George,
Isn't
I'd
that
be curious for your take on something. Sorry to
okay?
jump in. I'm curious. I haven't seen this yet, but retrospectives that go spectacularly badly maybe should be stopped rather than do more damage. Have you seen anything like that, and how do you bootstrap out of it?
So, what makes a retrospective go really badly? Typically, it's when somebody with power is trying to get their way and is playing a power game in what's supposed to be a retrospective. The best way I know to solve that problem is have another retrospective without that person. And I've done that before, where there was an official retrospective that had a manager in the room and nobody wanted to talk. And so they would talk, talk about the things that they thought the manager wanted to hear. And then have another retrospective of just the development team where people could say what was on their mind. And I facilitated that. I did a safety exercise at the beginning to see how safe people were willing to say they felt. And I also told them that they were the ones in charge of what, if anything, got reported out of that retrospective.
That's an excellent tip right there. I think that's an amazing insight that they are responsible for what goes out, and that really gives them that control. I think that's a great point there. And it's interesting you talk about the retrospective after the retrospective, right? I actually had a situation today where we were discussing a project and status, and I actually took myself out of the room because I am in a management position now, and I realized that they weren't talking, and I'd rather them have the conversation without me than tiptoe around issues and not get things resolved. So I actually just left. And I told them, I'm not going to participate in this. You guys have the issues that you need to talk through. I get that you don't want to talk about them in front of me, so here's your space. And I think that went a long way. They ended up coming out of that discussion, I think it was 2.5 or 3 hours later. It was originally a 30-minute meeting, but they had an excellent plan going forward. They came out of it smiling when before they weren't. George, it's funny you bring up that tip, and then today there was an application of it, but I can't stress it enough. That is a wonderful tip. Just they own the output. Whether or not you have a manager who will leave the room or organize around that, I can't support that enough.
Yeah, it really helps to have a facilitator, someone with facilitation skills. Now, that doesn't have to be someone does that all the time. Sometimes you've got natural facilitators in the group to help make sure everybody's voice is heard and keep things going and keep things from getting derailed, bring things back to, if they start going awry, raise awareness, if it starts becoming a blame session or a complaint session. And sometimes, particularly if they're companies that have a bunch of teams, then they may want to trade facilitators. Another thing about retrospectives is they can get stale. If you're going through, the same motions every time, then you can fall into a rut and not really think about what you're doing anymore. So there are different ways of mixing it up. You can do different exercises. You can do them at different intervals. There's lots of different things you can do. Doing the same pattern every 2 weeks will get boring. and people will lose interest in it and say, "Oh, this isn't doing us any good. We should drop retrospectives." Where I think they should learn how to do a better retrospective.
There was another interesting thread recently on Twitter about retrospectives where there's a camp of people that recommend a backlog of items from a retrospective, and then a very prominent voice came out and said, "I don't believe in lists, just fix the problem." And I think there were two things behind it. One, the backlogs grow, apathy sets in, and issues don't get fixed. And then two, when that happens, the value of the retrospective plummets and people stop participating because it's no longer worth the risk of speaking. But I'm wondering, what do you guys think about, the retrospective backlogs, if those make sense?
Is, it,
Is it the
is this a
is it the
backlog
role?
before the retrospective or of output from it?
It would be the output from a retrospective. So if you've seen those work well, if you think that makes sense, or if this was just someone venting.
I think you should pick, the team should pick one or two things that they want to address right now.
Yep.
There's always, opportunity in the future to do other things. And if somebody wants to work on something that the team didn't pick, they can do that. I worked with a team one time, and I forget how many, but for several sprint retrospectives in a row, then they said the thing they wanted to work on is we need to get better at pair programming. After they had done this several times and they chose this again, I said, "May I make a suggestion?" I said, "Why don't you choose something that you've got the energy to actually try to tackle? It doesn't have to be your biggest problem." And so they chose something else, and things got a whole lot better there because they weren't doing so well at pair programming when they thought, "Oh, we have to do this because this is our biggest problem." And they got somewhat better at that when the pressure was off. And it's self-induced pressure.
That's, I think, the risk of the idea of a backlog that comes out of a retrospective is they've already got a backlog, and that's what the one they're on the hook for. So you only have so much, cognitive energy to go around for also improving your work as you're doing the work. And on the one hand, I have sympathy for why do you have a bug tracker? Why don't you just fix all the bugs? Maybe applying that to the idea of retrospectives as well. But on the other hand, people need to make sure that they're delivering on what the product owner is expecting. And that's not anything in particular about how they do the work. That's up to them. So I think it's kind of pie in the sky and draining to set very high expectations for a backlog of things to be worked on. If they're important, they'll come up again. If they're solved, they won't.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that brings up an interesting, maybe this will be our final point on retrospectives, but the time it takes to just sit back and think, which, looping back to the original Twitter thread that started this conversation about retrospectives, I think it is possible to fix things at a point in time as they occur, but sometimes I'm just not smart enough to fix it on the fly. You guys ever feel like that?
Oh, sure.
That just something comes up and it's like, holy cow, I need to hit a few books. I need to check out George's blog, see if he's ever dealt with this before, and really try to figure out a good answer rather than something off the cuff just to deal with it and move on. And I think that's part of the value of a planned retrospective at the end of a sprint is that you have that time to think through a problem. You have that time to be intentional about a situation and to come to the plate with a well thought through solution. You guys think that makes sense?
It may not even be a well thought through solution, but the attention is what counts.
Right.
And so that makes me think of DeMarco's book Slack. If you don't have any slack, then you can't improve. Now, I put off reading that book for many years because I thought I knew what it said. And yes, it said what I thought it said, but it also says a whole lot of other things. It's an excellent book. But the thing is if you're trying to run at 100% capacity, then you're stuck. You can't do anything differently. And that's part of what retrospectives get you out of.
My favorite visualization of that is traffic.
Yeah.
And so this is there's a neat image that's floating around. I'll see if I can track it down and put it in the show notes, where it asks you basically what happens if a highway is 10% utilized. What does throughput look like? and it's amazingly fast. And then it goes up to 50 and things are still getting done. At 100%, nothing moves forward. You're wall-to-wall cars and you're not going anywhere. And I love that illustration, and George, I love that point because most managers are looking for 100% utilization of their resources, quote unquote, and it does not leave that time to be introspective about your own practices. It doesn't leave that time to have a meaningful retrospective, and it is definitely one of those damaging practices.
Yeah, 100% utilization on a highway is called a parking lot.
Exactly.
But you also see it in terms of network traffic. So on
Sure.
Ethernet, I think the peak throughput is something like 37% utilization.
Sure.
It's amazingly low. Otherwise, the collisions start becoming so much that nothing's getting through.
And I guess people do speak in those terms as well because in the office, at least I've heard a few times, do you have the bandwidth to take this on? And I think that that relates back to those concepts pretty well.
So this ties into my topic that I brought, which is metaphors for software development, really nicely.
Metaphors, huh?
Yeah, and
All
the
right.
context I'm bringing to that is in this consulting kind of a role, I find myself in situations where I'm helping a company that maybe doesn't specialize in software development, but does software development and doesn't know top to bottom organizationally what that's like. They may think they know what it's like, and they may not know. And short of putting them through school and getting an engineering education and learning XP and whatever else there is out there, I'm interested in collecting metaphors that might help explain to different kinds of leaders in different organizations what it is like to develop software in a way that helps them make better decisions about it.
So I always thought of it as 55 minutes of incredibly intense thinking and 5 minutes of typing per problem, right? And that's something that non-programmers have trouble understanding. They think, and especially some management thinks, if you're not typing, you're not working. And maybe it's the metaphor is not necessarily the strongest in the world, but it does highlight. It's not even really a great metaphor, but it's maybe more of an analogy. But it highlights that it's a thinking practice. We're not factory workers. We're actually doing creative work that requires thought, consideration, and eventually fingers start hitting the keys.
And vice versa, the fingers hitting the keys sometimes elicit the thought that couldn't be summoned before that happened. In the
Absolutely.
doing, you do the discovering of the thinking that you needed. So it goes
Yeah.
both ways. But that sounds more like reality than a metaphor.
It is emergent.
Yeah, and that's one of the surprising things I found with test-driven development is that by slicing the thinking and the typing up into these little tiny pieces, then they feed each other really quickly, and that's a benefit that I never expected to find.
Certainly for
But
me,
but explaining
yeah.
that to a manager, that's tough.
So a metaphor that definitely doesn't work very well is the construction one. But here are some metaphors that I dug up just to make sure I could attribute them correctly. There was one for gardening, which I quite like, and that apparently originates from Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas. There's Alistair Coburn's cooperative game. And one of them that really caught my eye recently, I don't know how I ran across it, Joshua Karyevsky talks about bargain hunting, looking for things that have pretty good value for low cost. So how do any of those strike you? Gardening, cooperative game, bargain hunting?
I think they're all valuable. Having been an organic vegetable farmer, then I've used that myself. One of the things, you can't just throw fertilizer and make things go faster. You have to in organic farming, you feed the soil, and the soil then feeds the plant. And so, in Agile, you want to feed the situation, make it a healthy place, and things will go more smoothly, rather than trying to push directly on the things you want. So that's one thing. I've used sailing metaphors before, but the problem with them is I end up having to teach people sailing first, and so it doesn't make a very good metaphor.
It does increase the billable hours, though, right?
I've known people to use music metaphors, particularly jazz.
I would be interested to hear more about that because my degree is in music.
Because there's a lot of interplay between people and the communication, the silent communication between members of a small jazz group is pretty amazing.
And they're improvising.
Right. Or they're speaking to each other through their instruments, really. And you can do that with your code, too.
So does that lend itself to even a pair programming metaphor then, as you have two people jamming on instruments and they start syncing up, and then you have two pair programmers who get synced up on code? And I actually like that one quite a bit. I think that's interesting.
And I think it's true across the entire team. When you get a team that gels, it's a pretty amazing thing. Probably most people have never really experienced that. I experienced it once before Agile. It was relatively short-lived because the company went out of business, but it really, we did a lot of work together in quite a short period of time. And when I discovered Agile, I thought, oh, this is the best bet for making that happen again, because it is based around teams.
So do you find that feeling to be elusive, George? Is it I always think of Shuhari, and I think of Ri as being perhaps attained 2 or 3 times ever, and it's elusive. And I wonder if that relates back to your thoughts there on a team that is fully gelled and is progressing like that.
I don't think that's a Shuhari thing. I think that's a communication thing. Communication and trust. And a lot of it, I've seen some teams do really well when you start out with setting good beginning conditions. What's his name? Hackman talks about that. He died about a year ago, I guess. It has done a lot of work on how to set things up for teams. But sometimes it doesn't take that much. People have a feeling for this, and starting out by emphasizing the teamwork and doing some exercises that help people become aware of what each other thinks about teamwork, and what are the characteristics of good teams, and what are the characteristics in places where they didn't, things weren't so good, and helps people make some choices that way, and helps. You can't force a team to happen, but you can lay the groundwork that enables it.
I've been looking at the work of Daniel Mezek, and he's written a pretty interesting culture book, and he actually is advocating starting an agile transformation or starting a new Scrum team with an open space exercise. So it's essentially setting the stage for getting a lot of issues out in the open, getting the concerns and fears and thoughts, right there in these different open space type sessions. And George, as you were talking, it just made me think of that maybe that's an interesting way of, to go back to maybe the gardening metaphor, to get that raised box built and the right soil in it and the right fertilizer and get that stage set. Do you have any experiences with that, or any thoughts on the idea of kicking off an activity like that with open space?
I'm a little skeptical about the range of situations where that could work. And the reason is that a lot of the situations I encounter, there are self-managed teams and there are self-directed teams. And if you're really going to do open space, then you're talking about self-direction. The team is really everybody is making decisions, and you're talking about a Zappos or Spotify type of company. And I don't think there are many of those. If the company is got investors who put in a lot of money and they want to have some say about what the business is that they're in, then that may not work as well. And I think probably one of the worst things would be is if you were in a situation where you were not going to let the team really make the decisions, and you pretended that you were, and you did an open space, and then they found that they were overruled on their decisions. So that could be a tricky thing, and so I have never seen Dan do this. So there may be a lot about what he does that I don't understand, but I think that it's okay to set boundaries around a team and say, within these boundaries, then you can do what you want, but here are the expectations we have of you. Here's the expectations the company has of you.
So that's probably the single best role that management can play for an agile team, then, is just setting those boundaries and expectations and getting that set early, and making sure that it's accepted.
And even, setting up the initial conditions for success. Trickling people into a team is not good for for team formation.
Right.
It'd be better to form it all at once. Moving people around from team to team is really destructive to teams. Every time you add somebody or remove someone, then the team has to adjust and to some degree really has to reform. Now, depending on the situation, they may do that rather quickly, but they're still going through sort of the same basic questions they did in forming the first time.
It so happens
Yeah.
that tomorrow, one of the teams that I'm coaching, they're about 10, and about 5 of them have been on the team for a while, and about 5 of them are new. It's a big team, and they're having a team building exercise tomorrow. So if we had done this a little bit later, I might have had something specific to say about that.
Well, it's always a topic for next time.
Yep.
I think we've hit that topic pretty well. And as I look at the clock, we might have time for perhaps one more dive into a topic if you guys are up for it. So something that's at the front of my mind and actually a part of a topic that I'll be giving a talk on next month is empathy for management. And so something that as I go to conferences, as I go through, the different training classes and read a lot of the literature, I'm noticing there is a slant against management in the Agile community. And some of this manifests in the Dilbert cartoons that are used in, the Scrum.org or the Scrum Alliance training guides, and the, pointing at the pointy head manager who doesn't understand anything. And I'm thinking that my concern is, and I've heard this expressed by managers, is that we're not friendly towards them. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Have we failed the management community? Are we not inclusive and friendly towards them? Have they earned some of this backlash? What are your thoughts on that? Is it a fair statement to say that we've not necessarily, that perhaps we've as a community have missed the mark with that middle management layer?
Well, I think we put them in a tough spot just by the message that we have, no matter how we say it. What we're saying is that this coordinating role that is maybe the primary function of middle management is not gone, but much less important. And there's not really a way to say that nicely other than quickly. And I don't know if there's a good way to get that message across. It's the same problem I think you guys talked about a little bit on the last episode about project managers in particular. They have skills that are relevant. Their role may be less so, but if there are things they can bring to the team that help, we want those. Same for any other kind of manager. If they have, useful behaviors that we can apply toward an agile team success, we want those behaviors. We just don't want all the rest of the stuff that comes with typical middle management. So I don't know how you say that to them nicely, other than we wish that you would want to be included.
Well, I've got a little different take on it because I think there's room for lots of management behavior on agile teams, in agile organizations. But what a lot of people think of as management behavior, I don't think is management. I think it's foreman. It's directing people rather than directing work. Manager is a little bit of a funny position. In Scrum, it's sort of split up between product owner and Scrum Master, both of whom are sort of playing aspects of that traditional management role in terms of, what gets done and helping facilitate that happening. And what order things, when are the deadlines, what are the priorities, things like that. But the hard thing is to let people, to trust people and facilitate people stepping up and doing the job themselves. But on the other hand, I run into an awful lot of programmers and testers who say, oh, the Agile conferences are no good anymore because they're all for managers. So I think that there's a perception in both directions. And I think the real issue is that it's hard to learn empathy for people who are filling a role that's different from yours that you don't understand very well.
So I've had an idea about that I would like to try sometime. Maybe you have. And that's experimentally, maybe for an iteration or two, everybody on the team rotate into a role that they think they wouldn't like or they don't understand. And experience what it's like to do that because somebody has to be responsible for it. And then maybe have some appreciation for the person who normally does. So have you heard of anything like that being done?
So I've never seen the rotation quite like that. What I have experienced, either through my own career progression or through people that I've mentored and promoted, is that when they step into a new role, the eyes just jet wide open, right? So they start immediately. I think it's kind of like growing up, going through your teenage years, hitting your 20s, getting established, and then calling your parents and saying, "I'm really sorry for the past, 5 to 10 years." Right? Uh-oh, did I make George choke? Yeah, I think it's really kind of like that,
Did you
where
call
you
them for
finally
that?
understand. Yeah, yeah, well, of course. I'm not paying those charges. No, I think it is kind of like that, where you get a new perspective, and all of a sudden things that didn't make sense to you make sense.
This ties into something George said early on about the, I guess, ecumenicism of an effective coach and consultant. Certainly for me, another reason that I guess I forgot to call out that it seems to be going okay so far as a beginner is that I have been in a lot of different roles in a team in an organization. And so at no additional effort, I have empathy for people in those situations. If it took more effort, I might not do it, or I might not understand what I was trying to do. But because I have, moved all the way around the circle and up and down the tree, my eyes are open and my heart is open. And if it were harder because I didn't have that background, then I might be less effective.
The problem that I think some of us are working against or trying to solve right now is that when a manager, let's say manager, director, VP level, when they hear the terms self-managing, self-organizing, self-directing, shields go up and it is a freak out moment. I actually gave a talk at a local company here in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and the second I started talking about self-organizing, the director of the team stopped me and was very adamant that I explain that and that I make it clear that management still needed. It was a very defensive posture that immediately went up. And the nut that I'm trying to crack is, how do we talk about Agile? How do we keep these people on board? Because in all honesty, if you get enough managers, directors, VPs scared, you're going to get your initiative killed. Even the best grassroots effort will not stand up to a motivated VP who does not want to lose his bonus and all those other things. So I'm wondering if there is a different approach needed by the community to address these people, or if we continue as is. And this is the nut that I'm trying to crack and what I'm really thinking through these days.
You put a finger on the same thing as my mental model, which is when we go to an organization in whole or in part and say we're going to change how it works, then everybody's scared. And they want to know that there is a role for them when this is all said and done, and a role that they can succeed in, because what they have is a situation that to some degree they've mastered. They understand the rules, they've positioned themselves inside it, they're comfortable with what's going to come next, they understand how the game is played. And we're coming in and saying, new game. So what kind of piece do I get? What kind of moves can it make? Am I even on the
Right.
board? And so I think that's the thing we have to address is, can we honestly say there is a role? Can we honestly paint a picture of what it is? If we can't, maybe that's what we should say.
Well, one thing I learned from Dale Emery is when in those situations, and whether you're looking at it from managers telling upper management telling the teams they're going to work in a different way, or things going in the other direction, what makes people worried is not worried about what they're going to get out of it. What they really tend to worry about is how can they contribute. That's the thing that Dale says that WIIT FM is not what's in it for me, but what's in it from me. And so you're right, it's changing the rules, and they're wondering, well, I know how to, I can play this other role blindfolded, but what am I supposed to do now? How can I contribute? How can I show value?
I think that statement right there, George, is hitting it on the head. It's, how do I show value? And that's something that I think a lot of people in that middle management role, myself included, really focus on daily. It's, you're earning the right to come back each day. You're making sure that your value is that you're adding value to the situation. And yeah, it is a real sense of loss, I think, to a lot of these managers when people come in and start talking about some of these Agile concepts, and that maybe it's the fear of loss of value or contributing. I like that take, George. It's a positive spin, and I think it could foster more empathy towards these people, because we are coming in and we are rocking the boat, and they are very intelligent people. They're usually pretty successful people moving up the ladder. They're very good at what they do, and they've used past skills to get there. And telling them it is a new game and a new day, I mean, it is quite the trick. So I really like that focus in on value and the idea that they are really thinking what's in it, I guess, from me. So I think if I look up at the clock, guys, we are at our time box. I have to say it's been an incredibly fun conversation. The time has flown by. Really appreciative of all of your insights. And at this point, we usually go around the table, give your contact info, anything that you're up to, any talks, conferences, workshops, anything that you'd like to plug and let people know about, and then we'll do the wrap-up. So
All right.
Go ahead.
I'll take it. Website is schmonz.com. Twitter is schmonz, SCHMONZ. There's a story, but we're time boxed, so I'll tell it another time. If you like the sound of my voice about half as much as I do, you can hear it in a few ways pretty soon. One is I'll be speaking at Agile Roots in June. I will be doing a DevOps workshop with Lisa Crispin and also an experience report of my own. If you want to hear something earlier, I'm speaking at Self Conference in Detroit, which is about half code, half humanity. And that's at the end of this month, May. And finally, if you want to go hear something from me right now on some topics that we touched on today, I just started a podcast called Agile in 3 Minutes, agileinthreeminutes.com. And the first 3 episodes are Agile itself, retrospectives, and trust. So if you want to help me figure out what to do next, you can look at the backlog at agileinthreeminutes.com and weigh in with your opinion.
Did you just plug a competing podcast?
It's not competing, collaborating.
No, that's awesome. I actually have listened to the first couple episodes of Agile in 3 Minutes, and I really enjoy it. I think I'm going to leave some comments for you, and I think it's a lot of fun. So that's awesome, and congrats on those talks. I hope they go well for you.
Thank you.
All right, George, how can people get a hold of you?
Okay, I'm George Dinwiddie, and I'm at G Dinwiddie on Twitter. I'm most prolific on blog.gdinwiddie.com. My company website is ideacomputing.com, IDIAcomputing.com. So you can find me in all those places and a scattering of others. And since I'll mention that since we were talking about retrospectives, next week I'll be out at the Retrospective Facilitators Gathering out in Tahoe, which is a small movable conference that it's been alternating between the U.S. and Europe for a number of years.
That sounds awesome. We'll have to get you back on to talk about how that went.
Okay.
Maybe we'll have some more retrospective tips for people. And I'm Ryan Ripley. You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Ripley. I blog at agileanswerman.com, and you can reach me by email, ryan@agileanswerman.com. Just want to thank everyone, first of all, for listening in. Without the listeners, it's hard to do what we do, so we really appreciate you. And you guys, thank you so much for joining on this episode. Great to have your insights. And I like I said, great discussion, great tips, and I can't wait to do this again. So thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for getting us together.